I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. This is our first lecture of the spring semester. So you can pick up a printed schedule outside. We'll have 4 or 5 more. You can always see it on our website. And if we have your email, you'll get announcements of our lectures and other programs from us. So see me if you'd like to do that. And let me introduce our speaker, our colleague Philippe Le Corre, who comes to us from the Brookings Institution. He's a visiting fellow in the Center in the United States and Europe at Brookings. His research focuses on Asia and Europe, their political and economic relations, China's foreign policy in Europe and France. And we originally were going to have Philippe talk a lot about that, but with the Paris attacks now of not even 3 months ago, still seems even shorter, we asked him to incorporate that topic into his talk tonight, larger issues of global terrorism and also America's role in this, what we do or don't do here, how it affects that part of the country. So I'm going to turn it over to Philippe, and we'll follow our usual format of about a 30, 40-minute talk, and we'll have some time for questions and conversation at the end. Philippe?
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for having me. Thank you to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I'm sorry I misspelled the name of the university in this slide. And I came to this city 37 years ago, so I was barely, a teenager. And it's changed a lot, obviously. Those of you who've been living here all these years would tell me more about it. But not just Las Vegas has changed a lot. The world we live in has changed a lot. And tonight, normally it's good to start a talk with a joke, but I'm not going to make many jokes, I'm sorry. Since we're going to talk about something quite serious and quite dramatic that is taking place in today's world, and in particular in France and in Europe. There's a lot to say about this subject, really, and I'm going to cover a sort of wide range of angles, so to speak. And what I'd like to do is perhaps not to talk for too long, so that you can ask me questions afterwards. So, well, we were just in January, and January is the month of greetings, and it's quite a big deal in France, and that's the time when you celebrate and you wish people all kinds of good things for the year to come. And this year, there have been fewer greeting cards and emails coming, and those who wrote didn't have perhaps the same cheerfulness about it. There's a sense of gravity, perhaps, and all the official ceremonies that normally take place in January were marred by this gravity. Now, obviously, the year 2015 will be remembered for France having faced an unprecedented wave of terrorist attack. And it started in January the 7th, when, as you may remember, 10 journalists were killed at a satirical magazine called Charlie Hebdo, 2 police officers, and then a kosher supermarket was attacked, and also several customers and staff were killed randomly by people who had not only automatic rifles, but also bombs and all kinds of weapons that are presumably forbidden in France. And the year ended, as Bill just reminded us, on November 13th, with the random killing of 130 people in Paris, one of them outside a stadium, but many of them inside a theater called the Bataclan, which is an old theater of Paris, and where in fact, an American rock band was performing. And last but not least, people were also shot on the streets, and some of these people was a sort of not too cold nights for Paris, and there were a lot of people sitting outside in bars and restaurants, and they were shot by people who really wanted to shock the French, shock the Europeans, and shock the world. So it's a lot of people have compared this to 9/11. Now, obviously, it's perhaps less people killed, but of course there were hundreds of wounded people, and very badly wounded people, dare I say, and thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people traumatized by this action. Because in fact, the victims were mainly young professionals, people watching a soccer game, people going to a theater, and people just having a drink or dinner. So that's, it's not the first time a free and democratic society has been targeted by terrorism, but it's certainly the first time in Paris. And of course, the Americans know about this because 9/11 is not so long ago. So the question many people have been asking me is, why France? And in fact, these are some of the issues I'll be covering in my talk. And it's not a very, you won't have 30 slides to watch, I'm sorry, but I will refer to a number of graphs that you will see later on. So the question is, why France? Why not Spain? Why not Britain? Why not Italy, Germany? But in fact, it's not just France. It's London, Madrid, it's Turkey, Lebanon, Mali, Indonesia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and many other countries. Just to name a few. And of course, they were targeted by different groups, by different organizations. And of course, I don't want to forget something that took place not far away from here, in the western part of United States, San Bernardino, a mass shooting. But as for France, it appears as, of course, one of the countries symbolic of free speech, one of the birthplaces of democracy, Western democracy, and a country that also has had a long, complex history of relations with the Middle East. And historically, it also has, as a consequence, one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest Muslim population in Europe, and the biggest Jewish population. And the system is what it is. It's a secular country. It's been a secular country for 200 years. And a country that's been coping with globalization, sometimes with difficulty. The colonial past keeps haunting France. And of course, economically, it's been less good lately than it was due to all kinds of factors, globalization, the debt crisis, and the deindustrialization, perhaps. But what I could add is perhaps that the mainstream French perhaps thought for too long that we were living in a happy multicultural society, and there wasn't any problem. Immigration, of course, has come primarily from former colonies, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, but also more recently from other countries. Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and and even Syria. I'll come to that in a moment, as you can imagine. And immigration was encouraged by the successive governments, because unlike some other European countries, France has always considered that immigration is a good thing, just like here in this country, and that it helps the demographics. But the problem is, at a time of high unemployment, the second and third generations of these immigrants have been finding it much more difficult to adjust to this environment, where with a high unemployment, and some of these young men in particular are facing unemployment rate of perhaps 25%. It's better for young women, but many of them have been resentful of a system that doesn't integrate them the way they would like. And they think it's to do with Islam. They think it's to do with their religion, with their name, with their origins, with the fact they are not really French, they're not really European. And in other words, that the system does not allow them to be what they are and to be part of the mainstream at the same time. Now, of course, we're talking about people who have acquired French nationality. And it's the case also in Belgium and a number of other European countries. I'm going to focus mainly on France because, there's enough to say, and obviously towards the end of my talk, perhaps I'll speak more about Europe. But it's very difficult for these young people, and some are not that young, really, they're in their 30s now, to believe in the French luminaries of the 19th century or 18th century, Voltaire, Montesquieu, these people. They don't really, it's not a reference to them. And many of them have not really achieved enough academically and do not really find that useful. And the principles of the French Constitution, the right to vote, the right to express yourself, irrespective of ethnic background and faith. I mean, these are parts of the French Constitution, but they don't really believe that it's for them. Many of them are angry, they feel ostracized. And perhaps the most worrisome part of all this is that most of these terrorists that committed these attacks are European passport holders. French, Belgian mainly, but Dutch also, several countries. And as you know, you can now circulate freely within the Schengen area, the European Union, without having to show your passport. This is one of the great achievements of the European Union. So there, a professor called Gilles Kepel recently demonstrated in his book that the current wave of jihadism meaning, going for Allah, Islamism, the concept of achieving a closeness to Allah, is a complex mix of social dereliction, colonial past, political disillusion, and Islamist intensification. And it started gradually about perhaps 20 years ago. There's actually Kepel talks about 2005 as a critical year. I was myself in the French government at the time, and it's a year very important in the sense that the first time large groups of second or third generation immigrants would actually take some kind of violent action on the streets against the establishment. And of course, it wasn't terrorism. It was really people coming out of their suburbs and wanting to demonstrate that they were unhappy about the system. And it started with two youth being killed, being electrocuted by mistake, really, because they were trying to escape the police. And it started all this, really, the 2005 movement. And somewhat the Salafism, which is an extreme Islamist movement, started to grow in France. I guess it started before 2005, but it became more pregnant, more intense. And of course, social media have helped this phenomenon to increase. Meanwhile, of course, the situation in the Middle East has also helped to convert people who were somewhat lost in their lives, didn't have jobs, didn't have a future, to get involved in some fairly extreme sides of Islam. Because you ask 95% of Muslim people, they would tell you that this is not Islam. Several hundreds of these young jihadists who have committed crimes have moved to Iraq and to Syria over the past few years. They joined Daesh, which is what people call the Islamic State, but I call it Daesh. And to find this sort of holy war against well, it's not necessarily the West, but it's all the people they call corrupt. So the corrupt regimes, we're all sort of more or less corrupt in this sense. The Western governments, the capitalism. So it's some kind of anarchies, really. And of course, a handful of them came back and committed these horrendous crimes, mainly through these random attacks, and also suicide bombing, which is unfortunately something very difficult to handle, as you know. So the response, of course, has been striking Iraq right after November 13th, striking Syria, even more so, trying to build a coalition of countries. That's what the French president, François Hollande, has been doing. And also trying to sort out the situation internally in France. Talking about, homeland security. Those of you who were in the US, I guess most of you, after 9/11, know that this whole process of homeland security was started in the years following the Twin Towers attack. And of course, it was at the time very complicated to enter the US as a foreigner, because there was all these restrictions. But now, of course, you could argue that this system is working. And in Europe, meanwhile, we were sort of opening our borders and behaving in a way like we were going to live in this peaceful world, which obviously is not the case. And somewhat now we're regretting, especially as Syria has become such a messy place. And we've also had hundreds of thousands of refugees. And meanwhile, the extreme movements I was referring to has been striking in different countries, not just in Europe, but also in many Muslim countries, in fact. So the consequence of that, of course, is that people are scared. And so the government, and I would say not just the French government, but also the German government and the British government, have been putting more police forces on the streets, more military. They have passed a legislation, anti-terrorist legislation in parliament, in the respective parliaments, and have really started warning people that it may happen again. Because being defensive is one thing, protecting people is one thing, but finding solutions, that's more difficult. And interestingly, the current president of France, Hollande, has become quite popular, just like President George W. Bush after 9/11. Wasn't always the case, but he became popular because people rally behind the president. He's the symbol of the nation. In some ways, a situation like that makes a country, a nation, stronger. The French are resilient, and they have long seen multiple races and colors becoming part of their society. And the country has a long history of immigration, and perhaps it's even better prepared than some other countries to face this kind of situation. If you think about Scandinavia, for example, which is now panicking, very extreme reaction from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, these places which were, sort of models of social democracy, and that are now sort of, the police is now protecting the immigrants because they're worried about some counter-reaction from the mainstream Swedes or Danes. Or just to tell you what a different world we live in. I mean, Sweden hardly has a Ministry of Defense. I can tell you, I worked in the defense department in my country. And Sweden thought, why should we have a defense ministry? No use. Maybe they are rethinking. Of course, another problem, a consequence of this situation, is the future of the European Union. I was referring to the Schengen Agreement, which is basically what's allowing people to cross borders. That's one of the two achievements, really, of Europe over the past 20 years. Actually, there are more than that, but two symbolic achievements. The European currency, made a big difference, really, for a number of countries. And even for visitors, tourists, they could just, use one currency, the euro. And the other achievement is Schengen. And Schengen means no borders. So when you say, all right, I'm closing the borders, what does it mean? Nothing. Impossible. Unless the European Union decides to reinstall a real sort of control of the borders, of the European borders, which may actually happen again due to the dramatic situation of these 1 million plus refugees that have come from Syria, a country that has more or less emptied itself of its population, or is in the process of doing that, and that is fully at war with itself. One reason being, of course, the terrible Assad regime that's been in power for several generations, but basically one ethnic group has been controlling the country, the Assad family, the Ba'athist movement. But there are also other groups, including the extremist jihadists I was referring to, who of course want to get rid of Assad in order to control the whole country and possibly merge it with Iraq, a place that was once attacked by the United States. And that obviously had consequences. So one of the other consequences is this, populism. What do people do in a democratically elected system when they get attacked by terrorists? What do they do when they feel, there's also some injustice, perhaps, as having immigrants getting social benefits or, having access to schools without speaking French, or, Well, people vote for the extremes. And the extremes are either left or right. And the left is not as popular as it was in France. You might remember 1968, but that's a long time ago. That's even before I came here. And unfortunately, the movement that has been quite popular over the past few years, and that could have been even more popular after the November 13 attacks, is the far right. And the far right is called the National Front, and so that's the dark blue one for you. And that is the result of the first round of the French regional elections that took place 3 weeks after the Paris attacks. You can imagine what the result could have been. That's basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major regions being won by the far right. Now, fortunately, what happened was that the red is left, that means the Social Democrat Party, the one in power, and blue is the center right. So none of the region in the end, because we have a 2-round system, none of the region in the end, none of the executives was won by the far right. Having said that, 6.8 million people voted for the National Front between these 2 rounds of election. That's quite a lot for a country of 65 million people. And obviously, a lot of voters would say, well, you know, we've tried the right, we've tried the left. Imagine here, we've tried the Republicans, we've tried the Democrats. Why don't we try something else? And something else is a movement that is basically anti-immigrant. You can imagine the risk for a society, a free society, to go into this kind of rhetoric. Now, the situation is like that in Europe. It's not just France. Pretty much every country now has a populist movement that would really play with this threat of having badly integrated immigrants, people who take the locals' jobs, you know, who don't have the same culture. I mean, it's all about culture, integration, and often Islam, although, you know, very few people would actually use Islam openly, as, you know, in the political language. But, you know, National Front, 27% of the votes, United Kingdom, UKIP, which is not exactly the same, it's more sort of pro-independence, but 12.4% is a populist movement as well. And all of those, you know, I mean, including in Italy, 27% for the 5-star movement. So we do have a problem. We are facing a Middle East that is in complete disarray. And Europe, which was this peaceful place with a fantastic project of, you know, everybody being friendly with each other and, you know, a democratically elected union with a European Parliament, a European Commission, and so on and so forth, now is facing the problem of some of these countries there towards the east criticizing Germany, obviously, for being so open about for refugees from Syria, and are now threatening, or in fact, not just threatening, they are building walls, literally, to prevent more refugees to come. Well, it's just giving you an idea about the situation of unemployment. The figure under 25, of course, shows that France is much higher than in the other parts of Europe, the dark blue one again. And of course, among this under 25, there are a number of immigrants. But I have to tell you that France has a very peculiar system. We do not distinguish people by religion. France is a secular country. You do not claim your religion when you vote, or when you answer questions from a pollster. This is not part of the French system. Therefore, we do not know how many of these under 25 are actually from, second or third generation immigrant. I'm conscious of the time, but what I'd like to say, perhaps also, is despite all this, and by the way, the EU in 1957 was only 6 countries. And today, 28. Most of them belong to this Schengen agreement, which means you can cross borders, and obviously it's much more difficult to ensure any kind of security or control. So there are all kinds of discussions at the moment whether borders should be reinstalled, whether a sort of European border police should be implemented. That would be, of course, very costly and very complex. But at the end of the day, Europe is not going to be disappearing. You can hardly ask countries that disagree with some of the measures to leave the European Union. So it's either going to be a two-tier Europe with a core Europe made of the sort of these founding members, perhaps. But then what will happen to the others? Will they become pro-Russians? Probably not. Will they sort of close themselves with their small economies? Probably not. Will they become more pro-American? I doubt it, because America is far away, and it's not the Cold War anymore. Will they welcome Chinese investments? Probably. But at the end of the day, what will save us from this situation is perhaps the French can set an example. The collective bravery that people demonstrate, and also the values that the Europeans have demonstrated over the past 50 years, since World War II, really. For example, I've never noticed that many French flags in Paris. People sing the national anthem. I mean, they seldom do that. There was a movement. I was in Paris briefly in January, as Bill said. I live in Washington now. But there were signs. Help your bistro. Go to the local bar to encourage people to show they are not afraid. I mean, of course, it's difficult to say you're not afraid. I have friends, they are on medication. A friend of mine, his wife is on medication because she's become, paranoid about this. And we know that terrorism could happen again, could strike again. I still think that France, in particular, will manage to reinvent itself with this diverse population. I think the answer in many ways is to do with the economics, creating jobs, and trying to find long-term answers, and celebrate the fact we have, one of the best education systems, one of the best health systems, one of the luckiest geography, strong demographics, and a dynamic population that is overall willing to fight for its quality of life. And as far as the future of the EU is concerned, I do believe the obvious solution would be for France and Germany to strengthen their cooperation, their partnership, because at the end of the day, they complement each other. You have France, which is good at diplomacy, defense. We have a strong military. That's why we've been striking Syria. And Germany is an economic powerhouse, definitely the most powerful economy in Europe. And the chances that the two countries will continue to work together on all the difficult issues are very strong. Europe was created on the ruins of World War II. Eventually, Germany joined in. Even Britain joined in, although that may not last for very long. There's a referendum coming up for those who have been following. But it's now an obligation, really, for Germany and France to act, of course, with the support of the United States. I think one of the solutions, really, would be to try to sort out Syria. That would certainly prevent more people fleeing out of the country. The Middle East is in a very messy situation. It's only a handful of people that have been training themselves as jihadists. The social media have been very damaging, but there's not much we can do about it. And unfortunately, this situation, the security situation, will be sorted by having more intelligence sharing, more security, and also trying to maintain the society. So, in other words, a mix of repression and security, and also of more positive feelings, and especially protecting the Muslims of Europe. 5 million Muslims in France. Now, do you think that would help if there were more anti-Muslim sentiments, anti-Muslim riots? Certainly not. That would just make things worse. So that's what we need to prevent in order not to steer the passions and the anxiety. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say, and I'd be happy to take any question on anything you like on France, Europe, on Syria, whatever is on your mind. Yes, please.
Just a couple of questions related to French politics. What do you think currently of the state of emergency and its recent approval of being extended in France? And second question is, what do you think, more of a broader international question, what do you think might have been the impact of the coalition in the first place in attacking? Because it's not really French history to align itself with the United States and attack regions in the Middle East. I would, just a couple of questions I was interested in finding out what you thought about that. Domestically the first, and international the
right.
second.
Well, the state of emergency, I don't think it changes anything. The problem is, when you have a situation like this, which is once again, random attacks against citizens in the middle of the capital city or anywhere, people expect the body politic to take action, to make a decision. So when you're an elected politician, what do? You send jet fighters to where the origins of the movement presumably are, Syria, Iraq maybe, but it's such a complex movement with different sides, different factions, that it's obviously complicated. I mean, you have Yemen, Libya, Sub-Saharan Africa, and there are different groups. There's even a group that strikes in Asia, the Central Asia, Chechnya, all this. And some of these people all go to Syria to be trained, because that's where one does jihad, presumably. So there's a risk that the movement might actually move towards Libya or somewhere else. And certainly one of the countries that is actually in the most critical states is Tunisia, which is the only country that came out of the Arab Spring with a democratically elected government, but it's also on the border of Libya, and doesn't really have a strong government at all. So to answer your question, I would say state of emergency. I mean, in fact, France has been under some kind of state of emergency for quite some time. There were terrorist attacks in the 80s and in the 90s, and not of the same scale, not suicide bombing, but just bombing. That's probably enough. Since that time, there've been police patrolling the streets, and sometimes military also. They're not allowed to use their weapons, but you see a military presence, which is of course not the job of the military. Job of the military is to fight wars, protect the territory, things like that. So I think it's just a way to show people that we live in a very dangerous world, and try to reassure them about this environment. As far as the geopolitics are concerned, now obviously a lot of these people who have been committing these crimes and have been joining these extremist groups have been using some geopolitical arguments. For example, the state of the Palestinians in the Middle East, who are presumably oppressed by Israel. That's an excuse for them to attack, some countries that are presumably friends of Israel. The fact that France, as a military power and as a friend of a number of African countries, have come to the rescue of the government of Mali, which was under attack by a jihadist movement. It's another reason to attack France. Things like that. And of course, this has been explained through a wave of propaganda in the Arabic language, in French, in English. And it's come to the ears of young people who basically have nothing else to do. And and some of them are criminals, spent a lot of time in jail. Some of them tried to be even soldiers or policemen, police officers, and were rejected. Their application was just rejected. You're not suitable to be a policeman. So some of them actually ended up being criminals. Can you believe that? So unfortunately, a sovereign nation cannot stop its foreign policy, and especially when it has international agreements with a place like Mali. In fact, there are many people from Mali living in France as well. So there are many French people living in Mali, and many Malians living in France. If the government of Mali, a friendly government, asks France for some help because they don't want to be overthrown by some radical faction or party, France, decides what it has to do, and in this case, handled that operation fairly well, I think, and it's been recognized as such by the Pentagon and other countries. And of course, there are a number of countries on this map where people don't have a military. I was referring to Sweden. And of course, they don't play a role in the Middle East, and they don't have the same history. Of course, the UK has a history with the Middle East. And of course, the US has a history, more recent. But as you know, the reputation of the United States in the Middle East is appalling. Since the war in Iraq and since, before, and, whatever the Bush administration tried to do, whatever the Obama administration is trying to do, the result is the same. People don't like the United States. And they see France, they see the UK, they see Germany as allies of the United States. So therefore, we have a choice. Either we give up, we just close ourselves, a little bit what some of the presidential candidates are advocating here in this country, but I won't go in that territory. Either you engage with some situations where you think you can actually improve the geopolitics, and especially in the case of Syria, where we've really messed up as a group of nations, because there are just thousands of people leaving Syria every day, including babies. There are babies dying on the beaches of Greece and Turkey How long can we take that? Nobody can sustain this. It's just horrendous. And meanwhile, one could hope that the Syrian situation will be sorted through diplomacy. That's what the current process is about. And at the same time, of course, there's a military action taking place with a coalition in Syria and in Iraq. Yes, sir.
Has the Schengen area furthered European security or further perverted it? And my second question is, you talked about second and third generation extremism. Is that a trend, or is it solely based off unemployment statistics in the early portion of this decade?
On the latter, obviously there are people. I mean, it's not like every Muslim in France cannot find a job. I mean, 5 million people, that's a lot, you know. I mean, they are really, we have ministers who are, you know, Muslims. The former justice minister was a Muslim. There are people who are doing well, but there are also people, because of the current economic environment, and I would say it has increased since 2008, because there's been a word crisis, as you're all aware. Therefore, when there's a crisis, when the unemployment is rising everywhere, of course the weakest parts is in even a worse situation than it was before. So I cannot give you statistics, but what I know is that in some parts of France in particular, the unemployment rate is very high, whether it's for young people or middle-aged people. And sometimes it is true that there's been some discriminations in the way people are being hired, and that's created a lot of resentment. But you know, it's difficult to fight. And sometimes there is actually a law which was established, kind of affirmative action, a little bit like here, to prevent this to happen. That means you can send your resume to an employer without giving your name or having your photo or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's complicated as a cultural thing, and also many of these people are not educated. They didn't go to university, and therefore it's harder for them to find a job, and so they would end up with blue-collar jobs, which is fine. But you know, for some of them, it's obviously not enough. Sorry, what was the first question?
Has the Schengen area furthered European security or further perverted it?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's perverted it, because it's a great idea. I mean, it's the idea first of all, economically, it was a great idea to have this continent unified, especially when you think about World War II, which wasn't that long ago, where, you know, you had Germany basically taking over most of Europe, and you had Britain with the help of the US and what remained of France trying to fight the Nazis. So 60 or 70 years ago, you have a unified Europe with a kind of unified government, which is mainly sort of on the trade and economic issues. And Schengen was meant to help, you know, this sort of internal trade situation. So the problem is, of course, many of the countries on the eastern part of Europe, central and eastern part of Europe, are now, which are former socialist countries, if you want, which were part of the Soviet bloc after World War II, are now behaving like they don't want refugees. You know, they don't want to have anything to do with this, because the countries are small population, and you know, and I mean, I can give you several examples: Hungary, Slovakia, even Poland now, which is obviously one of the biggest countries, the biggest of the new wave of EU members. These countries have elected populist governments, right-wing governments, that basically are restricting refugee arrivals. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question. I think it was a great idea, but the problem is the reality we're facing now is questioning this concept. Yes, sir.
Have the military and police forces for the French experienced an increase in enlistment from the immigrant populations to perhaps erase the suspicion that surrounds them?
Well,
Kind of signal that they are, in fact, on the French side rather than potential enemies?
well, I don't really know the answer, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure they are, just like anywhere. I mean, the military has its own ways to recruit people and make sure that once they belong to the military, they just, fight for the same master. So I don't think there's any problem on that side. Having worked myself in the Department of Defense, there are even imams. There are priests, of course, and there are imams for the Muslim soldiers in the French military. Now, obviously, I don't believe those people fighting in Syria. First of all, there are no ground troops, as you're aware. No Western country at the moment, in fact, no Middle East country either, has offered to send troops on the ground in Syria. So at this stage, it's mainly airstrikes. And as far as the French troops in Africa or in Lebanon or in other parts of the world, I mean, I don't think there are quotas or anything like that. I mean, there may be some Muslims, there may be not. I mean, we don't really ask people's religion. And that's, as I said, it's part of the French system.
But they don't they look a little different than someone who's clearly French, a North African?
Sure, but I mean, if they have a French passport, so they're as French as the others. I mean, they can be white, black, they can be of any religion, as long as they have the French nationality. There's nothing preventing them from joining the military. I mean, otherwise, it would be the end of the system, really. I mean, if you start selecting people based on their race, their religion, their identity, their sexual preferences, whatever, of course we don't have any of this. Yes, in the back.
Has there been any shifts in immigration policy in France since the attacks in 2015?
You mean recently? Well, actually, France has not had that many refugees for the past year compared to Germany. And the big story has been Germany because, I mean, that's another, yes, I'll come to you in a moment. Obviously, Chancellor Merkel had made this stunning offer to welcome 1 million refugees to Germany, which the French didn't do. One reason is we already have a lot of refugees, I mean not refugees, but immigrants, and the economic situation in France perhaps doesn't allow to have 1 million refugees. It would be a very complicated thing to do. Even 200,000 would be a problem. So I think we're talking about 60,000 or 70,000, something like this. I mean, there are constant waves of immigration coming from pretty much everywhere in the world, including Asia, including a lot of people from sub-Saharan Africa, and many of the countries I mentioned. I mean, there are different processes like asylum seekers, some family reunion. It's not an easy process. I would say it's slightly easier than here, but it takes less time. But still, it's a very lengthy process to become French. And even if you marry, if you're a foreigner, you marry a French national, it takes you at least 5 years before you can apply for French nationality. And asylum seekers, I'm sure it takes at least 5 years as well to become French. But once you've got the passports of any of these countries, you can basically move from one place to the other. And if you're Estonian, you can go to Portugal and live there, work there. You can even go to the UK, unless they leave, of course, the European Union. I don't think that's going to happen. But so that's also, I mean, when you open the borders in that way, it has led to a lot of opportunities, business opportunities for a lot of people. For example, I mean, there's a high unemployment in France, but many of these people, maybe they are in London or in Spain. You know, it's economically, Europe has become a unified market, job market, which is very interesting in itself. But politically, and that's where our British friends disagree, politically, it is still a kind of association between countries. Now there's an elected European Parliament, there's a commission, there's even a kind of foreign ministry in Brussels. But at the end of the day, you know, in a crisis situation like this, national governments take the lead. And in fact, you know, Bill was mentioning the US. I mean, when Ash Carter or John Kerry go somewhere, I mean, in Europe, they tend to go to Paris or Berlin or perhaps London. But they don't waste their time in Budapest unless, you know, there's a big issue there or a big meeting. But, I mean, you remember this joke about Henry Kissinger, who was asking which phone number he should use to call Europe. Well, I mean, for a while, it was Brussels. And it's turning to be Berlin and Paris for all kinds of reasons, but certainly on the security issues and the foreign policy issues. France has become the sort of best partner to the United States because the two countries are cooperating on intelligence and Syria and all kinds of issues that where France has become, you know, a big player, and of course that's offering more, you know, dangers to the French and leading to more dangers perhaps. But on the other hand, there's no choice. I mean, France is not going to sit there and wait. There is a very dangerous organization called Daesh, which is based in Syria and in various countries, and someone needs to tackle it and to prevent more terrorism and to prevent more Europeans to go there. That's another issue, tracking these people. Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. You have mentioned terrorism started it back in the early 80s, which is correct. It started it in Egypt in 1984 when these terrorist attacks happened, and then the former president of Egypt has warned the whole world about this problem for the 20th and 21st century. And then these guys, just to clear something, as you said about Islam, Islam does not encourage on killing innocent people or killing Muslims themselves, but these guys don't care. They have attacked in terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is, watching these news and these reports, they are about 30 to 50,000 people of these ISIS or Daesh, as you mentioned. Now the whole world with the three superpowers like the US, France, and now Russia in the area cannot get 30 or 50,000 that you can see them on TV holding some shotguns on the back of a pickup. While the US and their coalition in 2003 on the second Gulf War took the whole army of the regime of Saddam Hussein in 1 week, while 30, 50,000 cannot. Jordan, for example, when they get the hostage and they burn him, right away the king of Jordan has ordered strikes on ISIS. So every country is saying we're going to strike, but there is no results of capturing any of this. We understand back in 2001, the Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was hiding in the caves with the loyalty of the Taliban. So this is what I'm wondering, like we cannot control on 50,000 people. They are doing all these terrorist attacks. And my second question is, what measures did or is France taking to prevent future terrorist attacks or any terrorism attack?
Well, I mean, for the first part of your question, it's very difficult to fight people who are ideologically brainwashed, who are in effect convinced by the propaganda of these various movements. It's not just one, but various organizations, including Daesh, that they are fighting some kind of jihad war, and they are going to, first of all, going to paradise. That's why they don't care if they die or not. And secondly, that they are going to free the sort of oppressed world and oppressed countries which are run by infidels. I'm just simplifying. So the problem is, you have to dismantle the financial organization behind it. You have to use as much intelligence as possible. And I would say, I'm not, by the way, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, so please don't ask me too many detailed questions, but as Bill said. But, the people who need to handle the situation are the countries of the Middle East themselves. And that's where it gets difficult, because, there's a sort of ancestral conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias, and represented by the two biggest and most powerful countries in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And these guys don't want to get on. They don't want to talk to each other. And the problem is, of course, as you well know, I'm sure, the Assad regime is supported by Iran and by Russia. That's another story. I can talk about this later. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is supporting some of the factions fighting the Assad regime. The whole point of the negotiations going on now in Vienna, in Geneva, on Syria, is to try to have these people at least sitting around the table and agreeing on some kind of future for Syria. And unfortunately, it's not. There's no great solution. So I hope we find a not so bad solution. And to answer the second part of your question, I think intelligence sharing is the key, and also, unfortunately, the internet has become a tool for these terrorists. And if possible, we need to be more, to control a little bit more what's been said in the internet. And I think we have somewhat the means to do that. And I know it's against the human rights and things like that, but unfortunately, if it's been used as a weapon against free societies, we may have to reconsider the freedom of the internet. Since we're not in California, I can say that.
But sir, one last question, if you don't mind. About a week ago, one of the politicians in France has resigned because the French government is trying to pass a new law.
Yeah, the justice minister.
If you are a dual citizen, even if you were born in France, to strip you out of that citizen,
right,
out.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think this is a good measure also to prevent that?
Well, I don't really have an opinion myself, but I think the decision has not been made. It's not final. And the idea, the debate, for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's really about stripping someone of its nationality if he's committed a crime, or a terrorist crime, and whether, especially, there's an idea about the dual citizens and people who are foreigners. You can basically confiscate someone's French passport forever, in fact. So it's more that confiscating is basically stripping you from your nationality if you've committed a terrorist action. There are a lot of debates about this in the French Parliament, because the left-wing parties are basically saying, look, this is against our values, and if we do that, that's why exactly this minister was the Minister of Justice said. And honestly, I think she wanted to resign anyway, and there were probably other reasons for that. But that's politicians for you. But anyway, that's that's a short answer.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time, so we'll draw to a close here. But if you have a question we haven't been able to get to, I think we'll have some time afterwards. But thank you, Philippe, for helping us better understand a very complex and changing situation in the world. And I'll invite you all to join us for our next lecture, which will be 3 weeks from tonight, which would be the 24th. Thank you. We'll turn to a domestic topic. We'll have another colleague out from Brookings of ours, Elizabeth Kneebone, who's written a fascinating book on the changing demographics of poverty, and is going to look at a phenomenon called suburban poverty, and particularly with its applications in Nevada. So I hope you can join us for that, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again for your great questions.